I 25M need to share my story about my family situation and the revenge that's about to unfold. It all started when my father passed away when I was 20. He wasn't just my dad, he was my mentor, my best friend, and the cornerstone of our family. Growing up, he taught me everything from fixing cars to managing finances. Every Sunday morning, we'd work on his vintage Mustang together in the garage. He'd tell me stories about his youth while teaching me about carburetors and spark plugs. Those memories are still so vivid, the smell of motor oil, the classic rock playing on the old radio, and his patient voice explaining every detail. Our house was his pride and joy. He'd spent years renovating it himself, adding personal touches everywhere. The handcrafted bookshelves in the study, the custom-built kitchen cabinets, even the treehouse he built for me when I was 10, everything had his signature attention to detail. He was the kind of man who kept every receipt, every warranty, and every instruction manual meticulously filed away. Always be prepared, he'd say, because you never know when you might need something. When he died from a sudden heart attack, it felt like the world stopped turning. The house still smelled like his aftershave, and his coffee mug sat unwashed by the sink where he'd left it that morning. His favorite leather chair by the fireplace remained untouched. I couldn't bear to see anyone else sitting in it. The tools in his garage were still laid out exactly as he'd left them, waiting for our next Sunday project that would never come. My mother, 45F, handled his death differently. While I was drowning in grief, she kept herself busy, almost manically so. She redecorated the guest room, joined a book club, started taking yoga classes, anything to keep moving, I guess. I thought it was her way of coping, but then came the bombshell that changed everything. Not even 6 months after Dad's death, 6 months. She announced she was seeing someone. Enter Dan, 47M, and I honestly couldn't imagine anyone more different from my father. Where Dad was methodical and thoughtful, Dan was chaotic and impulsive. Dad built things, Dan broke them. Dad planned for the future, Dan lived paycheck to paycheck, when he actually had a paycheck. He was loud, messy, and perpetually between jobs, the kind of guy who thinks being obnoxious counts as having a personality. I tried to be understanding, really. I knew Mom was lonely, and everyone grieves differently. But then things started moving at warp speed. Before I could even process that she was dating this guy, they were engaged. 2 weeks later, they were married at the courthouse. No ceremony, no family discussion, not even a heads up to me or our relatives. Just a quick "we're married" text with a blurry selfie attached. And suddenly, our quiet, orderly house was invaded by Dan and his 2 kids, Lily, 22F, and Kyle, 19M. It was like a tornado hit. Lily was your typical entitled princess, the kind who thinks the world should roll out a red carpet wherever she walks. She'd blast her music at all hours, leave her makeup and clothes strewn all over the bathroom we now had to share, and act like I was the inconsiderate one for asking her to clean up after herself. Kyle wasn't as actively awful, but he was like his sister's shadow, backing up whatever she said or did. If Lily said the sky was green, Kyle would swear to it. Together, they treated me like I was some unwanted houseguest who'd overstayed his welcome in what was still legally my home. But Dan. He was the worst of them all. Within days of moving in, he'd claimed my father's chair as his spot. Watching him sprawl there, dropping chip crumbs all over the leather my dad had carefully maintained, made my blood boil. He'd bark orders at me like I was his personal servant, "Hey, grab me a beer," or "change the channel, the game's on." When I didn't jump to obey, he'd give me this condescending look and say, "Come on, sport, we're family now." Family? The way these people treated my father's memory was anything but familial. Dan started reorganizing the garage almost immediately, shoving Dad's carefully arranged tools into boxes to make room for his own junk, old sports equipment, half-finished project cars that would never run again, and piles of magazines he swore he'd read someday. The workshop where Dad and I had spent countless hours together became a cluttered mess. The changes didn't stop there. One by one, pieces of my father's life began disappearing. His coffee mug was replaced by Dan's collection of novelty cups with crude jokes on them. The vintage radio we used to listen to in the garage was swapped for Dan's Bluetooth speaker that constantly blasted sports talk shows. Even the family photos started vanishing from the walls, replaced by pictures of our new, blended family. The final straw came when I noticed my parents' wedding photo was gone from the living room mantel. In its place sat a selfie of Mom and Dan from their courthouse wedding, Dan grinning like he'd won the lottery, which, considering he was now living rent-free in our house and spending Mom's money, I guess he had. When I confronted Mom about it, her response hit me like a slap in the face. "We're making new memories now," she said, not even meeting my eyes. "It's time to move forward." Move forward? It hadn't even been a year since Dad died. My life at home became increasingly unbearable. Lily and Kyle acted like they owned the place, constantly invading my space and breaking my dad's house rules. They'd throw parties when Mom and Dan were out, leaving beer cans in the garden Dad had meticulously maintained. Once, I found cigarette burns on Dad's workbench. Kyle's friends had used it as an ashtray during one of their late-night hangouts. Living in my own house felt like being under constant surveillance. If I tried to spend time in the living room, Lily would suddenly decide it was time for her reality TV marathon. If I needed quiet to study, Kyle would start playing his video games at full volume. Even the kitchen became a battleground. They'd accidentally eat my groceries or leave the dishes piled up despite our agreed cleaning schedule. The worst part was watching Dan slowly take over every space my father had cherished. He converted Dad's study, where we used to sit and talk about my college plans, into his man cave. The walls that once held Dad's engineering degrees now displayed Dan's fantasy football charts and beer signs. The antique desk where Dad taught me to balance a checkbook became Dan's snack station, constantly littered with empty chip bags and soda cans. I tried talking to Mom about it multiple times. "This is still Dad's house," I'd say. "Don't you think we should respect that?" Her responses became increasingly defensive. "Dan needs to feel at home here," or, "the kids need their space too." When I pointed out that they were treating the house like a hotel and me like an unwelcome guest, she'd get that tired look on her face. "You're not trying hard enough to blend with the family," she'd say. Change is hard for everyone. Things came to a head during finals week. I was studying for a crucial exam in my room, the only space I had left, when Lily decided to throw an impromptu study group party. The music was so loud I could feel the bass through my floor, and their laughter echoed through the halls. When I went downstairs to ask them to keep it down, Lily rolled her eyes. "God, you're such a buzzkill," she sneered. "This is our house too, you know." "Actually, it's my father's house," I corrected her. That's when Dan stepped in, beer in hand. "Listen, sport," he said, using that condescending nickname I hated. "Your mother and I are married now. What's hers is mine, and what's mine is the family's. Maybe if you weren't so selfish about sharing, you'd have more friends to study with." I lost it. I told them exactly what I thought about their entitled attitudes and their disrespect for my father's memory. Mom came home in the middle of this confrontation, and instead of backing me up, she took their side. "Maybe," she said quietly, "it would be better if you stayed with your grandparents for a while. Just until things cool down. Just until things cool down." That's how she phrased kicking her only son out of his own house. What she didn't know, was that Dad had prepared for everything. He'd left the house and several other properties to me in his will, with a trust that would activate when I turned 25. My mother knew about the inheritance but conveniently seemed to forget this detail in her rush to accommodate her new family. Moving in with my grandparents was a blessing in disguise. They lived in a modest house across town, and unlike my mother, they understood grief. They gave me space when I needed it but were always there when I wanted to talk about Dad. My grandfather, especially, became my anchor. "Your father was always prepared," he told me one evening as we sat on their back porch. "He knew life was unpredictable, so he made sure you'd be taken care of." That's the kind of man he was. Those words became my mantra as I watched from afar while my mother and Dan played house with my inheritance. Every week brought new changes to my childhood home. They painted over the walls Dad and I had decorated together. They replaced the custom kitchen cabinets with cheap modernist ones. They even sold some of Dad's tools at a yard sale, I found out through a neighbor who bought his favorite wrench set for $10. Mom would call occasionally, acting like everything was normal. She'd tell me about their family game nights, their holiday plans, how well everyone was getting along. She never acknowledged that she'd chosen her new family over her own son. When relatives would ask about the situation, she'd paint herself as the victim of my inability to adjust. The final insult came when she called about Dad's properties. "Dan's been having trouble finding work," she said, her voice casual like she was discussing the weather. "We thought maybe you could sign over one of the rental properties to him. Just to help him get back on his feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Those properties are my inheritance from Dad," I said. "He left them to me for my future." "Don't be selfish," she replied. "Family helps family. Dan needs this." That was the moment I stopped seeing her as my mother and started seeing her as what she'd become, just another person trying to take advantage of my father's hard work. But I had a plan. While they played happy family in my house, I was preparing. I researched property law, talked to financial advisors, and lined up contractors for the renovations I'd need. My grandfather helped me connect with a realtor to assess rental values in the area. Everything was in place for the day I turned 25. They think they have all the time in the world. They think the house is theirs to do with as they please. But the clock is ticking, and in just a few months, they're going to learn what it feels like to be kicked out of their home. Dad always taught me to be prepared, to think ahead, to plan carefully. Well, I've done exactly that. And when the time comes, I'll make him proud by taking back everything that's rightfully mine. Let's see how they like being the unwanted guests for a change. Update 1. This is an update to my previous post about my family situation. When I turned 25 last week, everything changed exactly as planned. Here's how it all went down. The morning of my birthday, I had my lawyer send official notice letters to Dan, my mom, and even Lily and Kyle individually. The letters detailed their legal obligation to vacate the property within 2 weeks. I also had a locksmith change all the locks while they were out at one of their family brunches. Their reactions started rolling in one by one. First was my mother's frantic phone call. "What is this letter?" "Some kind of joke," she demanded. "No joke, Mom. Dad left the house to me, remember? You've got 2 weeks to find a new place. But we're your family. You can't just..." "Family?" I cut her off. "Was I family when you kicked me out? When you let Dan take over Dad's workshop? When you tried to get me to sign over Dad's properties?" She started crying, those same tears she used whenever she wanted to manipulate me. "We have nowhere to go. Lily's pregnant, did you know that? How can you do this to your pregnant stepsister?" Yes, Lily's pregnancy. Their ultimate trump card. I'd actually heard about it through relatives months ago and had already prepared for this emotional manipulation attempt. "Lily's pregnancy isn't my responsibility," I replied calmly. "She's got 2 weeks to figure out her living situation, just like everyone else." Next came Dan's attempt at intimidation. He showed up at my grandparents' house, puffing his chest out like an angry rooster. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he growled. "We've been living there for years. We have tenant rights." I smiled, pulling out a folder. "Actually, I have documented proof that you've never paid rent, utilities, or contributed to property maintenance. You're classified as guests, not tenants." My lawyer confirmed this. "Want to see the paperwork?" His face turned an interesting shade of purple. "This isn't over," he threatened before storming off. But it was over. I'd spent months preparing for every possible scenario. When they tried claiming they needed more time to move, I had movers already scheduled. When they threatened legal action, I had documentation of every house rule they'd broken, every piece of my father's property they'd damaged or sold. The most satisfying moment came when Lily tried to play the victim on social media. She posted a tearful story about being thrown out on the street by her cruel stepbrother. I responded by posting the security camera footage of her selling my father's antique tools at their yard sale, along with screenshots of her texts bragging about how they were going to redecorate their house once I was out of the picture. As the 2-week deadline approached, they tried everything. Mom called relatives to pressure me. Dan threatened to sue. Lily's pregnancy symptoms conveniently became complications requiring bed rest. Kyle suddenly developed anxiety about moving. I remained unmoved. The day before the deadline, I visited the house to check their progress. They hadn't packed a single box. "We're not leaving," Dan announced, trying to look authoritative in my father's old chair. "You'll have to evict us legally." I pulled out my phone. "Okay, I'll call the police then. I'm sure they'd be interested in the illegal modifications you made to the house without permits. And those prescription medications you've been selling from my father's old study? I have documentation of those too." Dan's face went pale. Turns out I'd known about his little side business for months. Add that to the evidence I had of him selling my father's belongings without permission, and he was looking at some serious legal troubles. The next morning, they were packing frantically. It was almost comical watching them scramble, especially since I'd hired security to supervise their move and ensure they didn't take anything that wasn't theirs. Mom made one last emotional appeal as they were loading the final boxes. "Please," she begged, "we can work something out. We're still family." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing. "No, Mom, we stopped being family when you chose them over me. When you tried to erase Dad's memory. When you treated his legacy like your personal piggy bank." As they drove away in their moving truck, headed to some cheap apartment across town, I walked through the house they'd left behind. The damage was extensive. Walls needed repainting, floors needed refinishing, and Dad's beautiful custom cabinets would need to be restored. But underneath it all, this was still the house my father built. His spirit was in every beam, every nail, every careful detail. Standing in his study, soon to be restored to its former glory, I found one of his old notepads. On it, in his precise handwriting, was a quote he'd obviously meant to share with me someday. "A man's legacy is not just in what he leaves behind, but in how those who receive it honor his memory. I'm honoring your memory, Dad. Every step of the way." The house is now undergoing renovations. The contractors are fixing everything Dan and his kids damaged or altered. Dad's workshop is being restored to exactly how he left it. I even managed to track down some of his tools through the neighbors who bought them at that yard sale. The best part? I found Dad's old Mustang that we used to work on together. Dan had sold it to a local collector, claiming it was his to sell. I'm in the process of legally reclaiming it, and the collector is actually helping me build a case against Dan for fraud. My mom keeps trying to reach out, probably because their new reality is setting in. Without my father's house and assets to leech off of, Dan's true colors are showing. I heard through relatives that he's becoming increasingly angry about their reduced circumstances. Karma's funny that way. Lily's pregnancy isn't going as smoothly as she'd like in their cramped apartment, and Kyle's having trouble adjusting to not having his gaming room anymore. Welcome to the real world, kids. Some relatives are still trying to guilt me, saying I've torn the family apart. But here's the thing, there was no family to tear apart. They destroyed that the day they kicked me out. All I did was reclaim what was rightfully mine. The house is quiet now. No more parties, no more fighting, no more disrespect for my father's memory. As I sit in his chair, properly cleaned and restored, I can almost feel him here with me, proud of how I handled everything. Dad taught me to be prepared, to think ahead, to stand up for what's right. That's exactly what I did. The house is back where it belongs, and soon it will be as beautiful as it was when he was alive. To everyone who supported me through this, especially my grandparents who gave me a home when I needed one, thank you. And to those asking what's next? Well, let's just say the properties Dad left me are doing very well under proper management. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about reclaiming what's yours and honoring those who truly cared about you. Update 2. A few weeks have passed since my last update, and things have taken an unexpected turn. I received a message from my mom that was different from her usual guilt-tripping attempts. "Can we talk? I owe you an apology," it read. Simple, direct, no manipulation. I met her at a coffee shop near my grandparents' place, somewhere public to avoid any scenes. When I walked in, I barely recognized her. Gone was the confident, well-put-together woman who'd been defending Dan for years. Instead, she looked exhausted, worn down, like she'd aged a decade in just a few weeks. She started talking before I even sat down. "I need to apologize," she said, her voice shaking. "For everything." Then she revealed what had been happening since they moved out. Apparently, losing the house had stripped away Dan's charming facade completely. Without my father's assets to leech off of, he'd shown his true colors. She described how he'd become increasingly hostile, blaming her for everything. "You couldn't even keep your son in line," he'd yell. "Now look where we are." The thing about Dan was, he'd always been careful to play the charming stepdad when they had the house. But in their cramped two-bedroom apartment, with bill collectors calling and no free ride anymore, that mask slipped completely off. She discovered he'd been running various scams from my father's study, not just selling prescription medications like I'd uncovered, but also running investment schemes targeting elderly residents in the neighborhood. He'd been using our family's good name and reputation to gain people's trust. He even tried to forge documents to claim ownership of your father's other properties, she admitted, tears rolling down her face. "I found the paperwork hidden in his desk when we were moving. He was planning to sell them as soon as he could figure out how to transfer the titles." The revelations kept coming. Those business meetings he claimed to have? Actually meetups with gambling buddies where he'd lose money he didn't have. The job interviews that never panned out? He wasn't even going to them. Instead, he'd been borrowing money from loan sharks, using my mother's name on the documents. Lily and Kyle weren't doing much better. Without their cushy setup at my house, their true natures were showing too. Lily's pregnancy wasn't getting the princess treatment she expected in their small apartment. She'd been throwing constant tantrums, demanding her own space, better furniture, more attention. Kyle had to give up his gaming room and actually get a job at a local fast food place, something that apparently triggered multiple meltdowns about how unfair life was. "I didn't just lose your father," my mom said, wiping her eyes. "I lost myself. I was so scared of being alone that I let this man and his children erase everything your father built. Everything you deserve to inherit. I watched them disrespect his memory, mistreat you, and I did nothing." She pulled out divorce papers from her bag. "I'm filing today," she said. "I should have done it the first time he sold your father's tools. Or when he turned the study into his office for his schemes. Or when he convinced me to kick you out. I was so blind." I sat there, processing everything. Part of me wanted to say, "I told you so," but the broken woman in front of me wasn't the same person who had chosen Dan over me all those years ago. "Dan's furious about the divorce," she continued. "He's been telling everyone I'm having a mental breakdown, that I'm unstable. He even tried to claim he has rights to my retirement account since we're married. But I've got proof of his schemes, and his loan shark problems are catching up to him. The local police are now investigating Dan's various fraudulent activities. Turns out, selling my father's tools and belongings wasn't even the tip of the iceberg. He'd been running cons throughout the neighborhood, using his position as my stepfather to gain trust. Several elderly neighbors had invested in his fake business ventures, believing they were supporting our family. Your father would be so ashamed of me, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He trusted me to honor his memory, to protect you and his legacy. Instead, I let a con man take over our lives. I learned that Dan had been methodically targeting recently widowed women before he met my mom. He had a pattern: find vulnerable women with assets, charm them with his fun data routine, then slowly take control of their resources. My mom was just his most successful mark. The renovation of the house is almost complete now. The contractors found more damage than we initially thought. Dan had actually removed some of the original fixtures my father had installed, probably sold them too. But we're restoring everything to its former glory, piece by piece. I've been documenting the renovation process, partly for myself and partly because the police needed evidence of the property damage. Each discovery, from the ruined hardwood floors to the dismantled custom cabinets, adds to the case against Dan. The neighborhood has rallied around us since the truth came out. Old Mrs. Johnson from next door came by with photos she'd taken of Dad's tools being sold at that yard sale, evidence for the police investigation. Mr. Peterson from across the street helped me track down some of Dad's custom woodworking pieces that Dan had sold off. As for Lily and Kyle, they're facing their own reckonings. Lily's pregnancy complications mysteriously improved once she realized they weren't getting her back into the house. She's moved in with her boyfriend's family, who are apparently not thrilled about the situation. Kyle had to drop out of college because Dan had actually stolen the money Mom had set aside for his tuition. The house feels different now. Not just because of the renovations, but because it's finally free of their toxic presence. Dad's chair sits in its proper place, restored and reupholstered. His workshop is almost back to how it was. I even found some of his old project sketches that Dan had stuffed in a box in the attic. My mom asked if she could visit someday, once everything's finished. Not to stay, she clarified quickly. Just to see it restored to how your father had it. To remember what I almost let them destroy. I haven't given her an answer yet. Part of me understands that she was a victim too, manipulated by a professional conman during her most vulnerable time. But another part remembers how she stood by while they dismantled my father's legacy piece by piece. For now, I'm focusing on rebuilding, not just the house, but my life. The rental properties Dad left me are doing well. I've started my own business, using the workshop just like he always hoped I would. Sometimes when I'm working late, using his restored tools, I can almost feel him there with me, proud that his legacy is finally being honored the way it should be. As for Dan, last I heard, he's facing multiple fraud charges. His loan sharks are looking for him, and several of his past victims have come forward with similar stories. Turns out my mom wasn't his first target, just his most recent. The police are particularly interested in the forged documents they found. Apparently, he's pulled this inheritance scam before. Some relatives still think I should forgive and forget, for the sake of family harmony. But Dad taught me that family isn't just about blood or marriage, it's about respect, honor, and doing what's right. I'm honoring his memory by protecting what he built, by refusing to let his legacy be destroyed by people who never deserved to be part of it. The house stands restored now, every detail just as Dad would have wanted it. His presence is everywhere, in the carefully maintained woodwork, in the organized garage, in the peaceful garden. It's not just a house anymore, it's a testament to his vision and hard work, protected and preserved for the future. Maybe someday I'll be ready to have a relationship with my mom again. Maybe she'll earn back some measure of trust. But for now, I'm content knowing that I protected what mattered most, the legacy of a man who taught me the true meaning of family, responsibility, and strength. The sun is setting now as I sit in Dad's chair, looking out over the garden he planted. Everything is quiet, peaceful, restored to its proper order. In the workshop, his tools await tomorrow's projects. In the garage, the Mustang we used to work on together sits partially restored, my newest ongoing project. This isn't just a story about revenge or justice. It's about honoring those who truly loved us, about protecting what matters, and about having the strength to stand up for what's right, even when it means standing alone. Dad would be proud. In the end, that's all that matters.